hash law. Do you accept the scientific evidence that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse warming gas, and what's the ramifications if we carry on as we are?
Well, yeah, obviously, you know, the global scientific consensus is that not only is carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases driving the process of climate change, but it could potentially lead to catastrophic consequences if we don't resolve it. Now, we do need to dramatically reduce our emissions, but we need to do that in a way that achieves social justice and achieves a sustainable economy as well. And to me, that means challenging the kind of growth, ever more conventional, middle of the road and market-dominated economics. We need a different kind of economics where we meet human needs while living within the limits that the environment sets down for us.
On that subject, do you believe that sustainable capitalism can work?
Well, I've never seen it anywhere. I've never seen anything that I would recognise as sustainable capitalism.
What's the limit? What can we do to keep the equilibrium between growth and jobs, but still look after the planet?
Well, I mean, the jobs issue is interesting because sometimes people imagine, and some politicians would try and say that you need economic growth if you're going to have jobs. You certainly need economic growth if you're going to have profit in a capitalist system, if you're going to have investment being given a return. But a low carbon, low energy economy is, by definition, it's going to be a high labour economy. And so there are opportunities to look at low carbon industries which would be labour intensive. And so long as we're creating those jobs in a way that supports workers, in a way that supports equality between people, and gives people good terms and conditions in which they can work, and doesn't exploit people, you know, I think we've got the opportunity to do it. Replacing economic indicators like gross domestic product with a wider range of indicators that talk about social and environmental justice would be one good first step. GDP just tells you how much money is swirling around the economy. It doesn't tell you who's benefiting and who's getting the social and environmental harm put on their shoulders.
Can I go back to the scientific evidence? Some say that science is flawed. How can you convince them otherwise? Or can you convince them otherwise?
Well, the scientific process is the only means, the most reliable means by which we can try and understand the world around us. And you know, politicians need to listen to what the scientists have to say and then make a judgment, just as we all have to do in our own lives. You know, you could read every scientific paper there's ever been, every study there's ever been about what food is safe to eat or what lifestyle changes are going to be risky or less risky. But at the end of the day, you have to make a judgment, and that may be about degrees of uncertainty and risk, not just about hard facts. Now, what society has to do globally is look at the evidence that's been found. It seems very, very clear that climate change is A, happening, B, being driven by greenhouse gas emissions, human-induced emissions, and C, could cause immense harm, irreversible harm to the life support system we depend on. It would be a pretty reckless judgment, in my view, to say that we shouldn't take action given what we know. That's not to say that we know everything we need to know. There are still areas of doubt, for example, about how quickly climate change will happen, or how quickly we can limit the effect of our own greenhouse gas emissions. Of course there'll be areas of doubt and uncertainty. It's a developing science. But to take no action, to refuse to take the kind of action that the Climate Change Act sets out, would be a really reckless judgment, in my view.
There's an argument specifically on politics UK, is that the scientific debate should be ignored and more effort should be made to highlight the political debate, for example, the advantages of renewable energy. What's your thoughts on that? Because what's happening is we have debates on climate change, and with one set of people saying the science is flawed, and we've got another set of people saying the science is good, and we just go round in circles, and what people are saying is we should forget about the science and concentrate on the political debate.
Well, I certainly don't think we can forget about the science, and you do have to make a value judgment about the quality of the argument that's being put forward for and against, and it seems to me that we have to dismiss those who are saying that we should ignore the arguments about science. But what you do have to do is join up the scientific arguments with the social and economic arguments. What kind of economy do we want to run? What kind of society do we want to live in? So for example, one of the main policies that we've been pushing for the last 4 or 5 years is on energy efficiency, reducing the amount of energy waste in homes, in buildings, in offices and so on. Now, you can pose that in terms of energy security and greenhouse gas emissions. You can also pose it in terms of saving people money on their fuel bills, and you can also pose it in terms of retaining jobs in the construction sector. Small businesses in the construction sector that were under huge pressure at the beginning of the recession and are still under pressure now. So, you know, that's a policy that works environmentally, it works socially, and it works economically. And so presenting it in all 3 of those terms is the best way of making the case.
There's also an argument that it's irrelevant how individuals in the UK act, as there are other nations whose CO2 output is increasing as fast as ours is decreasing. How do you answer that? How can my actions make a difference? Or do my actions make a difference?
The world is not going to resolve this issue by everybody holding their hands up and saying it's somebody else's problem, it's somebody else's fault. And certainly countries which have a high historic contribution to climate change by having industrialised early, like Scotland, having created some of the ideas that gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. A country like Scotland, or a country like the UK, absolutely has to take responsibility. And if a country like this, like Scotland, which has such substantial renewable resource, so it's an easier achievement for us to, an easier course for us to set, if a country like Scotland isn't willing to do it, then nobody will. So we absolutely have to lead by example. On our own, it's not enough, absolutely.
Do you believe that other countries are abdicating their responsibilities on carbon emissions?
Overwhelmingly, the world's governments have failed so far in terms of the global negotiations, for example. It's interesting the different reasons why that happens, though. In America, it's about the structure of their democracy. Very often it's a tussle between state and federal power, for example. Now, if it's left down to the federal level to make their decisions about what they'll do, the US will never have an overall figure that it can put on the global negotiating tables and say, look at how much America is willing to do. Whereas if it's decided at the federal level, at the US level instead of the state level, then many of the states, the federal government, the state governments will say the federal government doesn't have the right to force it to do this, and so they'll be fighting their own government internally. Whereas in China, you know, you don't have the inconvenience of democracy, I guess. They don't respect human rights, they don't have a democratic process, and yet as soon as China makes a decision to go down a particular route, it will go down that route dramatically. And so they haven't moved away from coal, but they have gone into renewables in a number of ways. They've gone into issues like redesigning cities more sustainably. And so they've been able to do some things much more ambitiously, other things less so. So there are different reasons why a country like China and the US might be not yet taking full responsibility. But Scotland and the UK don't have those reasons. We've got the political will, we've got the economic opportunity, we've got the environmental resources like renewable energy. You know, if a country like Scotland or the UK isn't willing to act, then who will? You know, we have to lead by example.
To bring it back to the local level, this is a question from Richard. What is the best way to encourage businesses to go green?
Well, very often the best way to encourage them to be interested in the first instance is to talk about saving money. Wasting less energy, wasting less resources is a great way of saving money, and it supports your bottom line. But really, that's the beginning of a conversation, and I think what you have to do is to get people to recognise that the long-term well-being of a society, a community and an economy is dependent on living sustainably. And if they want their business to be sustainable, they need society around it to be sustainable as well.
Stakeholders. It's a different subject altogether. There's a question from Mike Hashler, and I'll quote him. Many feel that wind farms are a blight on our landscape. We kill rare birds, and the advantages of wind industry is outweighed by the disadvantages. Also, Eastern Partnershire Council are planning to rezone parts of Lensley's Moors for housing. What is the point of a Green Party which does nothing to stop land destruction and actively encourages the destruction of Scotland's natural beauty?
Well, Mike is a campaigner on these issues. I'm aware of his name. You know, pretty much any energy infrastructure is controversial. That goes for whether you support a renewable energy policy, a nuclear energy policy, a fossil fuel energy policy. Pretty much all energy infrastructure is controversial. Wind is no different. It's very clear to me, perhaps not to Mike, that we need to dramatically reduce our CO2 emissions, and that means decarbonising the electricity sector. In the long term, back through into the 2020s and 2030s, we'll be getting a huge opportunity from wave and tidal energy. But at the moment, wind, onshore and increasingly offshore, have a crucial role to play. Now, organisations like the RSPB, whose interests are about bird life and about the wider environment, other environment NGOs, I think they take a very responsible approach. They don't say all developments in all places are good or all developments in all places are bad. They say, how can we engage with the developers to make sure that they take account of those concerns and change their developments, change their proposals, for example, move the turbines, fewer turbines, change the location of particular developments. That's the right approach. And good developers, responsible developers, respond well to that. And in any industry, there's a range of good and bad practice. But I think the government's role needs to be ensuring that we get the renewable energy onto the grid, but that we do it in the most sustainable and safe and environmentally responsible way.